Hey guys, so today we're going to be doing our last lesson of the first unit. We're going to be looking at how the composition of the atmosphere has changed over time. So for this lesson on atmospheric composition, we're going to be talking about that balance between photosynthesis and respiration that happens in the atmosphere. We're going to look at something called the Archean eon and how atmospheric conditions were at that time. Then we're going to go over what caused the Great Oxygenation Event. And then we're also going to look at how levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have changed over time. So when we talk about atmospheric conditions, what we're talking about is the ratio of different types of molecules in Earth's atmosphere. And when we do this, we usually talk about dry air, which just means we're removing water vapor from the equation. And we do that because water vapor percentages vary greatly from region to region and from time to time, even in a specific region. It depends on things like the weather at the time, the climate of that area, how humid it is, stuff like that. So we're going to be looking at just dry air, which those ratios remain fairly stable regardless of where you are on Earth at a given time. So our dry air is made up of about 78% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen, 1% argon, 0.04% carbon dioxide, and then small amounts of other gases like methane and some noble gases. When we talk about gas exchange equilibrium, which we kind of touched on when we were doing the carbon cycle and the oxygen cycle, this is essentially the equilibrium or the balance between photosynthesis and cellular respiration in terms of the exchange of carbon dioxide and CO2. Both of these processes are opposite reactions. Photosynthesis will take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Cellular respiration will take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. So ideally, those rates would be fairly similar to one another in order to stay balanced with one another. If the levels of one of those, so if the levels of either cellular respiration or photosynthesis goes up or down, then that can kind of decrease the stability of the atmospheric conditions by taking the system out of equilibrium. When Earth was first formed, which was about 4.6 billion years ago, it actually had almost no atmosphere, and the Earth's surface wasn't solid, it was molten or liquid rock. As the Earth cooled, it started to form its atmosphere, and the gases in the atmosphere was made up mostly by the gases expelled by volcanoes. Early on in Earth's life, there was a ton of volcanic eruptions because the Earth's surface, which was, again, entirely molten rock originally, cooled from the outside in. So the outside layer would cool, but like very shallow beneath the surface, you would still have this molten rock that would burst through. And then over time, as the Earth cooled more and more, that layer on top of the molten rock became thicker and thicker and was able to suppress more volcanoes. So yeah, the further back in Earth's history you go, the more volcanic eruptions there was. So yeah, there was a lot of gases being expelled from that. Those gases included things like hydrogen and methane gas, as well as a lot of carbon dioxide and nitrogen gas. About 4 billion years ago, so 0.6 billion after this first started happening, the Earth finally cooled enough that water vapor started condensing, which finally allowed some surface water to stay on Earth in liquid form. Okay, then we get to something called the Archean eon. This lasted from about 4 billion to 2.5 billion years ago, starting right after that formation of surface water, when the water vapor started condensing, and it ends with something called the Great Oxygenation Event, which we'll talk about later. Early on in the Archean eon, a lot of Earth's atmosphere was made up of methane, which caused the atmosphere to be very hazy. It was difficult to see through. Also contained lots of hydrogen gas, lots of sulfides, which are toxic, water vapor, and nitrogen gas. but there was no oxygen gas on Earth. Oxygen atoms existed in other molecules like water, but they didn't just float around as like two oxygen atoms attached to one another, which is what oxygen gas is. At this time, all life on Earth would have been anaerobic, meaning that it doesn't require oxygen, obviously, since no oxygen gas is available. But then about 2.8 billion years ago, these microorganisms called cyanobacteria evolved and kind of like took over Earth's oceans. And cyanobacteria were photosynthesizers, meaning that they produced oxygen. And this was the first time that oxygen was being produced here on Earth, was by these cyanobacteria. When the cyanobacteria first started producing the oxygen didn't just go into the atmosphere and stay there the way lots of photosynthetic oxygen does nowadays. Instead, the oxygen tended to bond with other elements to form things like ozone or carbon dioxide, or it entered an oxygen reservoir like the ocean. So lots of this oxygen that the cyanobacteria, which again lived in the ocean, a lot of the oxygen being released by the cyanobacteria was just dissolving into the ocean around them. It wasn't going up into the atmosphere. And it wasn't until that reservoir was full, which was a few million years later, that the oxygen finally started building up in the atmosphere. So again, the cyanobacteria are in the ocean. All the oxygen that they're releasing is just dissolving into the ocean. It's not until the ocean is essentially full and cannot dissolve any more oxygen that the oxygen finally starts getting released into the atmosphere. And it's at that point when the oxygen starts building up in the atmosphere that we end the Archean eon. That is the start of the Great Oxygenation Event. This happens right after the Archean eon, when oxygen starts to appear in significant amounts in the atmosphere. So when we have that buildup of oxygen in the atmosphere. Slowly following that, we have more organisms evolving that can produce oxygen via photosynthesis. So the oxygen levels in the atmosphere was actually quite a bit higher than it is nowadays, because we had so many photosynthesizers and not a lot of organisms that are using that oxygen. At this point, all of the organisms that exist are still anaerobic, meaning that they don't require oxygen to survive. But finally, when we had this really high level of oxygen in the atmosphere, we did finally have some aerobic organisms start to evolve. Those aerobic organisms would undergo cellular respiration and take in the oxygen from the atmosphere, releasing carbon dioxide instead. And this kind of started the move towards an equilibrium between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. This is the first time cellular respiration was even an option as a process that a living thing would undergo. So the levels of oxygen in the atmosphere did drop off following that evolution of aerobic organisms until it stabilized at about 21% of dry air, which is what it is now. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated more than oxygen levels did. Prior to life on Earth, there was a ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because the volcanoes were releasing a lot of carbon dioxide and nothing was taking it out of the air. Then our cyanobacteria evolved. Again, they are photosynthesizers. They were the first photosynthesizer. So they started taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, putting oxygen in instead. And then millions of years later, we had the evolution of plant life, like trees. They were able to take even more carbon dioxide out of the air through photosynthesis and to put more oxygen into the air. And initially, after plants like trees evolved, there was no decomposers that could break down plants because they had never existed before, so you had never needed an organism to decompose them before. So what that meant is that any of the carbon that was stored in the plants when those plants died didn't get returned to the atmosphere the way it would if they decomposed. Instead, it was just stored in those plants essentially, which they were then buried and compressed under with a lot of pressure and heat, and eventually turned into coal that we use nowadays. But eventually, bacteria and fungus did evolve that could break down those plants. Then, when those trees died, they would decompose and release carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere. So once we had the evolution of those decomposers, the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere started going back up again for the first time ever, like ever since the evolution of the cyanobacteria. And we no longer had coal forming anymore, because coal and other fossil fuels, well, coal specifically, only forms if the plants don't decompose, which only happens if decomposers don't exist. So that is why coal is not something that forms anymore or has formed for millions of years. Okay, so now we had carbon dioxide levels dropping because of all the trees. That did result in some anaerobic organisms going extinct because they actually need carbon dioxide instead of oxygen to survive. But once the decomposers like the bacteria and fungus evolved and started releasing carbon dioxide from dead plants back out into the atmosphere, that kind of stopped that extinction of anaerobic microorganisms. Then we had the evolution of animals, which would undergo cellular respiration and also release carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere started to increase as animals became larger. This peaked during the era of the dinosaurs, where we had very, very large organisms undergoing cellular respiration. But we did also have very, very large trees at that time. Following the extinction of the dinosaurs, those levels of carbon dioxide started to drop down again. And that was kind of, fairly stable for a long period of time until the Industrial Revolution, at which point carbon dioxide levels increased in the atmosphere faster than ever before, and to levels not seen since, Earth was just a little molten baby. Fun fact, many mass extinctions have coincided with large spikes in carbon dioxide levels. Yeah. So human impacts on carbon dioxide levels. Again, most of this started with the Industrial Revolution, when humans began to burn coal, which is a fossil fuel, which releases carbon dioxide. And then as other types of fossil fuel combustion became popular energy sources, that started to release even more carbon dioxide. We started deforesting the planet, which meant less photosynthesis, so less carbon dioxide being taken out of the atmosphere. So that is why we have had such a dramatic increase in our carbon dioxide levels, which has been tied to the first ever instance of human-made global warming and climate change. Certainly not the first time in our history that global warming has occurred or that climate change has occurred. In the past, following, again, some of those massive chains of volcanic eruptions that happened when Earth was very young, that also resulted in the Earth undergoing massive climate shifts. So did like the asteroid impact that contributed to the death of the dinosaurs, also would have resulted in some dramatic climate changes. This one is just happening, because of us. Okay, how do we know what atmospheric conditions were like, over hundreds of thousands of millions of years? There's a couple different ways that we look at this. One is through ice cores that we can analyze to determine how much of different types of gases were dissolved and then frozen in the ice at different times. We talked about this in Science 10 when we were going over some of the evidence of climate change. Essentially, you drill down into a very, very old and very, very thick glacier. You can count back all of the years based on the stripes of the ice core, and then take little samples of those different stripes of the ice to see how much carbon dioxide and oxygen was present in the atmosphere. Layers of sedimentary rock can also be analyzed for the presence of different molecules that become more or less common as atmospheric conditions change. So one of those examples would be rust. Rust really only occurs in the presence of oxygen. So the more rust that's present in a layer, the more oxygen was present at that time. We also have our stromatolites, which are a type of rock formed by layers of cyanobacteria that can also be analyzed to determine when cyanobacteria were high, when a lot of them died, that sort of thing, which corresponds with atmospheric conditions. When carbon dioxide levels are high, you tend to have more cyanobacteria, and then as the oxygen levels increase because of the cyanobacteria, they tend to die off. Okay, so I would highly recommend that you draw out kind of like a timeline that corresponds with the stuff that we've just talked about, specifically carbon dioxide levels. Actually, I will do that for you. Give me a second here. Okay, so if you look at this first kind of timeline here, I'm going to be looking at how different levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen happened over time. So when there was lots of volcanoes back when Earth was just first kind of forming a crust and there was still a lot of molten rock, we had lots of volcanic eruptions, which resulted in lots of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but there was no oxygen gas present. Then cyanobacteria evolved, at which point they started taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and adding oxygen into the atmosphere. Then trees evolved. They started taking even more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and adding even more oxygen into the atmosphere. And then for a long time, when those trees died, they just turned into coal, which meant that they were storing their carbon and not adding any more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. But eventually, decomposers evolved. Decomposers added carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere anytime they broke down something that had died, like a plant or something. They also used oxygen, so they dropped the oxygen levels. As animals evolved, cellular respiration means that they are adding carbon dioxide and taking oxygen out of the atmosphere. With the extinction of the dinosaurs, that did mean that you had less large animals undergoing cellular respiration. So at that point, carbon dioxide levels did start to drop down just a little bit again. And then we had, a long time after that, the Industrial Revolution, where we took coal and other fossil fuels and burned them. At that point, we had a dramatic increase in the levels of carbon dioxide, though it didn't really affect the oxygen levels. The only thing that then affected the oxygen levels was deforestation, but I'm not going to bother putting that in. The one other thing I wanted to talk about is kind of where the Great Oxygenation Event fits into all of this, which would happen, you know, somewhere in between here, but I wanted to zoom in on that a little more. So again, first we just had our anaerobic life. Cyanobacteria specifically evolved, and they were photosynthesizing, so they were producing oxygen for the first time ever. But all of that oxygen that they were producing was just going into the ocean. Eventually the oceans filled up, they couldn't contain any more oxygen. At that point, oxygen goes into the atmosphere and starts to build up. It is at that point when oxygen starts to build up that the Great Oxygenation Event occurs. So this is the Great Oxygenation Event. Prior to that, whoa, that did not work out. You get what I'm trying to do there. Prior to that, we are in the Archean eon. Okay, let me know if you have any more questions about this stuff.